maybe we'll kick off and people might join as we get started. But I'm Ed, I'm one of the activism coordinators, and I'm just going to kick off our webinar tonight. I'll start us off with an acknowledgement of country. I'm on Wurundjeri country in Naarm and want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respect to the elders past and present, and also to any Aboriginal people that may be listening today. Also want to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and acknowledge that this land always was and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. At Amnesty, we always stand in solidarity with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in their continuing fight for justice and all that encompasses. Thanks so much for joining the webinar to celebrate the recent committee report on a Human Rights Act, and also hear what some of the next steps for our campaign for a Human Rights Act are. So I'm just doing a brief welcome now, but we'll hear from Nikita shortly on what was in the report. There'll be an opportunity to ask any questions about what the report included and didn't include. Ira and I will also talk a bit later about what our next steps are. We'll hear from Satara, not Elsa, sorry, on what how we got to this report and what the activist journey looked like to see this great win in our campaign, and then more opportunity for questions about what you can do to stay involved and continue to advocate for a Human Rights Act. I'm going to kick us off by passing on to Nikita, who's going to talk a little bit about what was in the report, and yeah, over to you, Nikita.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm one of the campaigners at Amnesty. And yes, have been working on the inquiry and the report for the last year or so. So I've been really excited to see the report released last Thursday and what was in the report. And just as a background, if people haven't been involved in this whole process, Labor came into government with a promise to consider legislating a Human Rights Act. And a Human Rights Act is something that Amnesty in Australia, as well as a lot of other organisations, human rights organisations, civil society, have campaigned for a really long time, because I think most people know this, but Australia is one of the only liberal Western democracy without a Human Rights Act, and there are many countries that protect human rights in law with human rights acts. And when Labor was elected, we did a fair bit of advocacy with MPs, calling for them to fulfill that promise to consider legislating a Human Rights Act. There was a lot of other organisations calling for that as well. And the Human Rights Commission also put out a position paper called Free and Equal, which contains their basis for a Human Rights Act in Australia. And after all that happened last year, the Attorney General referred an inquiry on the federal human rights framework to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. So last year, during that inquiry, over 4,000 Amnesty supporters sent submissions, and this was really important to us because when we presented at the committee at a hearing, the committee made note of that. They were acknowledged by the committee, and we know that these submissions made a difference, as well as the 4,000 template ones. We know there were a lot of personalised ones that people sent, as well, explaining why human rights acts were important to them and to their communities. And some of those from the New South Wales activists and from Darwin activists were quoted in the report. So I really wanted to thank people for that. We've been speaking to MPs for nearly 2 years now on a Human Rights Act, and one thing we've consistently heard is how important it is for them to hear from you, from their constituents, because they know there are a lot of organisations campaigning for this, but they need to know it's important for their constituents to prioritise it. And with the submissions that you sent to the inquiry, they did hear from their constituents. And they released the report last Thursday, and we're really, really pleased with the report. It has a number of recommendations, including recommendations to increase human rights education in Australia, to improve parliamentary processes, to strengthen human rights analysis. But most importantly, it recommends legislating a Human Rights Act. And it provides a lot of detail of that recommendation. It provides a draft act to be considered. And really pleasingly, it's a really strong act in terms of what they are proposing. And we believe it would do a lot to improve human rights in Australia. And what it does recommend is covering rights that are contained in the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, things like your right to a fair trial and so on, but also rights that are contained in the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And we believed at Amnesty that that was really, really important, because a lot of human rights abuses we see in Australia are related to people's economic, social and cultural rights. And they've also recommended legislating the right to a healthy environment, which we also believed was really important. And we're really pleased to see that in the report. Other things the recommendation includes a course of action, which means if someone's rights are violated, they can take that complaint to court, they can make a complaint and have a way to seek remedies when their rights are violated. And we believe that's really important, because people whose rights are abused deserve justice, but it also creates I guess a preventative mechanism, because if government actors know that they can be taken to court or that a complaint can be made, then they are less likely to commit human rights abuses. And so this is really a really strong recommendation. It also requires the government to consider human rights when making decisions. So it puts an onus on the government, whether it's a minister, a department secretary, or a NDIS officer or a Centrelink officer, to think about human rights when making those decisions. And it includes a particular clause which requires participation with particular communities. So this comes from the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So those all include a requirement to consult and to ensure the participation of these communities. And that's in the report. And again, we believe that's really important, because we know that when communities that are impacted by these decisions are included when decisions are made about them, that it will improve what we see in terms of policy, but also in terms of services. In a really positive note, I'm happy if you have any questions about what particularly was in the report. Those were the things that we were looking for, in terms of, is this an act that we would get behind and say, yes, we support this recommendation for a Human Rights Act and this particular Human Rights Act that is being recommended. And we really do believe they've ticked those boxes, and that this is an act that will make a difference. But if you have particular questions about any particular areas, clauses, things the government might have considered in the report, do let me know. I'm happy to answer them. I wanted to add that in terms of the committee, this report was supported by independents who are on the committee. So that's Kylie Tink and also Lydia Thorpe. And so it's really nice to see a strong support from across the parliament. We know a lot of independents are supporting legislating a Human Rights Act, and so do the Greens. And so we do really want to see strong support from across the parliament for this act. And it was good to see that last Thursday. But I did want to note that the coalition did not support the committee's recommendations. They released a dissenting report, which is their way of saying they don't support it and they don't want the government to legislate a Human Rights Act. And that was particularly focused on religion. They made the point that they think Australia has a good human rights record, which we know, isn't true. And I think the Guardian, in their coverage of the coalition's dissenting report, kind of made the point of the Robo-Debt Royal Commissions, the Aged Care Royal Commissions, and the Disability Royal Commissions show that we don't have a good record when it comes to human rights abuses. They also suggested they had concerns that this would supersede parliamentary responsibility to the judiciary, and also concerns that it prioritises the right to live free from discrimination over rights for religious freedom. And we don't agree with that analysis of this bill. I think it's really important to note that there is no right to religious freedom currently covered in Australian laws, and this would protect that right, but it would also ensure it's balanced against other rights, including the right to live free from discrimination. But we don't want to be, I guess, focusing on their opposition, the opposition's opposition, and on what they've been saying, because we want to be focused on what we believe, which is that this is an important act that will protect the rights of Australians that aren't protected in law of anyone in Australia, and it will allow them to take action when their rights are violated and will prevent human rights abuses. But I think it is important just to note that maybe some of the conversation in the coming months, that is what the opposition, the coalition, will be raising, it seems. And I do believe those are things we can overcome and we have a strong response to, but we do really want to focus on what we think and why we think this is an important act. And in terms of the next steps, after a committee releases a report, the government needs to consider the report, the Attorney General, and he said that his department is considering this report right now and respond to recommendations in the report. So this is what the government is doing at the moment. What we want them to do now is to accept all the recommendations, but particularly the recommendations to legislate a Human Rights Act and to commit to legislating one. At the moment, there are, as I mentioned before, a lot of organisations campaigning for a Human Rights Act, and we are one of them. But what we know that MPs need to see, they tell us it all the time, is that their constituents are calling for one because there's a lot on their plate. There's a lot of issues they're trying to juggle, and they're going to prioritise what they hear is important from their constituents. And so what's really a priority for us for the next few months is working with activists and communities to show MPs why they support a Human Rights Act. They want the government to legislate a Human Rights Act and to accept the report's recommendations. And so we're really happy to support you and your communities in meeting with MPs, in holding town halls for MPs, in writing to them, calling to them, whatever that looks like for you, so that you can show your MP that you support one. Also that you can work with your community to build support in community, and that can be shown to an MP. I wanted to note that we have been focusing a lot in the last year, 2 years, on members of the Parliamentary Committee because they've been conducting this inquiry, but we will be expanding our focus now that the inquiry is finished and the recommendation is out there to a broader set of MPs. So obviously we want to talk to Labor MPs, particularly because it is the government. As the government, it's them who will have to legislate this. But we also want to be talking to the crossbench, to the Greens. As I mentioned, most of the crossbench already support this, but when it comes to priorities, again, they have a lot on their plate. So I think it's really important that they see their support from their communities on this. And we think it is important to talk to the oppositions, the Liberals and the Nationals, because they need to see, again, that their communities support this. If they're going to oppose this, they need to know, that this isn't something their communities want them to oppose. It's something they want them to support. And I think particularly when you consider counter campaigns and that sort of thing. If they know that their communities support this, then they're less likely to run a counter campaign on it as well. And I wanted to note we are heading at some point into an election cycle. So it's also an opportunity to engage with candidates because we will have some new MPs in Parliament next year. We'll have a new makeup of Parliament. And so it's really good time, if you can, to get in touch with MPs and with candidates, because they'll be out there campaigning and wanting to talk to their communities and to try and get them to announce their support for a Human Rights Act. And then hopefully, yeah, we can go into the election with a commitment from the government to legislate a Human Rights Act. We'll see, what the makeup of Parliament is after the election, and then we'll be pushing for that commitment that we hopefully have to become a reality and for a Human Rights Act to be legislated. And that's all from me. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks so much, Nikita. What we might do now is hear a little bit from Satara and celebrate the work that was done to get to this outcome, and hear a little bit about the activist journey to this stage. And then we'll come back to some questions towards the end if you have any for Nikita, maybe after we've also shared what some of the immediate amnesty campaign actions look like. Maybe what I'll do is stop sharing these and hand over to Satara.
Can I just check that you're able to see that?
Yeah, we can see you and hear you.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for having me. I'm Zimian from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, so I'll just acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm on and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. But I am thrilled to be here today to share a little bit about what work has been done by the ACT/Southern New South Wales branch, specifically in the lead up to this report release. So I'd love to shed some light on our kind of campaign efforts over the past kind of year or so. So on a personal level, this was quite important for me because I'm a young carer for a family member with a severe disability. I'm also a woman of colour. I come from a background of migrants, and so I have firsthand experiences of things like the complexities of the NDIS and the significant impact of legal protections or even lack thereof for marginalised communities. So this was a very personal journey for me as well as a professional one. And it was really awesome to kind of meet other people who were equally affected and passionate about having a human rights framework for Australia. So yeah, just reiterating what Nikita was kind of saying, now more than ever, I think the robustness of Australia's human rights laws have been put to the test. And it's quite easy to see that in things like the Closing the Gap review that was recently done, and the shortfallings of the NDIS report that was also just released, as well as, coming out of the Disability Royal Commission, among many other reports. So I think it's very evident that this is timely. So just for some context, sorry. So essentially what our campaign, go to slide first. Our campaign was interesting in that, being based in the ACT, we kind of have the precedent of a Human Rights Act in our individual jurisdiction. So this was kind of the first legislation of its kind, making the ACT the first state or territory to enact such protections. And some of the various rights include the right to recognition and equality before the law, the protection from torture and cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment, and freedom of thought, conscience, religion and belief, and taking part in public life. So our campaign within the ACT was interesting because we were also quite proximate to Parliament and members of Parliament who were involved in this. So we got to meet with MPs and do kind of community outreach in that sense. So for example, we engaged with politicians like Alicia Payne, who's the member for Canberra, and also was a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. And we also got to meet with people like Dr. Andrew Lee, who's the Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury, as well as the Assistant Minister for Employment. and also Senator David Pocock's office. So we got quite a nice little mix of people there, all of whom showed a lot of enthusiasm for this cause. And obviously seeing the kind of recommendation, Alicia Payne did indicate to us at the time that she was very much kind of looking to recommend that, recommend an HRA. We were even quite lucky to get a response from the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, as well, and who kind of showed some support for the potential legislating of such an act down the line. So now, obviously, with the report released, with the recommendation for a Human Rights Act, it's clear our efforts aren't going unnoticed. And like, I'm very excited to particularly share that the ACT Southern New South Wales submission from Amnesty was highlighted in the report, particularly emphasising the importance of mandatory human rights training for public sector employees. And so you can kind of read on the screen there the quote that was included in the report. So it was a little bit of a nice kind of win and acknowledgement of the work that we've been doing to kind of see that in fruition. So I'm not going to go on too much longer because I just wanted to highlight some of the ways in which we've kind of been working towards this campaign. But something that we have been working on that's coming up fairly soon is a kind of town hall panel discussion event that we're doing with Emeritus Professor Rosalind Croucher, who's the current president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, to discuss like what kind of actions are required by our government and all Australians to strengthen and protect human rights for everyone, both in Australia and globally. And obviously Professor Crouch is quite a busy woman, so it's really awesome that we're able to kind of have her come to this event and have a quite intimate kind of conversation as to how we can kind of implement human rights within our legislative framework. So if you are available on Tuesday, the 18th of June at the ANU here in the ACT to hear from Professor Croucher and maybe ask some questions, you're more than welcome. And maybe we can share the kind of link to the Humanitics page after as well with attendees and so on. But yeah, I guess to finish off, as you all know, this campaign for this legislation doesn't exist in some kind of vacuum. It exists, you know, within the flaws and failings of our legislative system to protect our most vulnerable people. And kind of having been an activist in this particular campaign, I've worked with incredible people on the grassroots level who have really suffered their entire life from not having these protections in place. So it's a very personal fight for so many. And therefore, that's what makes this win kind of even more sweet. So yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of continuing working in this space and look forward to kind of, you know, hearing what Amnesty activists get up to as well in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Satara. That's so exciting to hear all the work that you did, and that the report was also included in the recommendations. Well done. Super, super exciting. And the town hall sounds really fantastic as well. That's quite a good segue for Ira and I to talk about some of the upcoming actions and the things that we're hoping to run to continue putting that pressure onto MPs in the way that Nikita was talking about, all the way into the election and maybe even beyond. So what I might do is just start off talking about a couple of the small actions that we have at the moment that you can take to support the Human Rights Act, and then pass over to Ira to do the same. So something that you might have seen a few weeks ago as we were waiting for the outcome of the report was a Share Your Stories action. So what we're essentially asking activists to do is to talk to us kind of a little bit like Satara was able to do then, and explain why a Human Rights Act is so important to you and how that might impact your life or those in your community or those around you. We know that, as Nikita was saying, it's going to be really important that MPs hear from community voices and their constituents as to why they support a Human Rights Act in legislating it. So we're hoping that what we can do is find some really exciting ways to share these stories digitally, maybe if we're recording them ourselves and submitting them to Ira and myself, we can make some really great, we can work with you to make some really great content, whether that's sharing it on social media or just shooting it through to your MPs, or working on some longer term projects that link all these different constituencies in with all the different reasons why we should be legislating a Human Rights Act. And I think Ira has shared that in chat, where you can submit those videos and learn a little bit more about what we're trying to achieve. We also set up an email action so that as soon as the report came out last week, activists could contact their local MPs, their local senators, and demonstrate that community support. So what we could do is show to local MPs that this act means something to people, and it's not another committee report for filing away, and it's actually something that people want to see legislated by the government, and they want to see it legislated soon. So we've written an email there that you can hop on, put your name on, and then if you enter your postcode, you can send it to your local MP or your senators and help us push that along. And then the other thing that we're hoping to do, as Satara mentioned, is run some town halls. So obviously there's one coming up in the ACT, and we'll try and include the RSVP link for that, maybe in a follow-up email, or we can even try and chuck it into the chat. But they're such a great strategy to demonstrate really rapidly how many people care about something. So if we can fill rooms across all the countries and invite local MPs along, or take lots of photos to demonstrate to those MPs how many people care, and particularly different constituencies of interest, young people, workers, people with all kinds of lived experiences coming together and talking about a Human Rights Act, we're hoping that those events will be a really good demonstrator to decision makers of that mass support. And yeah, we can just, there's an email in the chat that's for Ira. You can just reach out to us if you're interested in running one of those in your local area, and we can help you make it happen. There's just a few of the actions that we're starting off with, and there's a couple of other ways that you can keep engaged with the campaign, but I might hand over to Ira to talk about those.
Thanks, Ed. Hi, everyone. I am going to take the next couple of minutes just to share a little bit about our toolkit and talk a bit about MP engagement. So I might share my screen, Ed, if that's okay. Yeah, so let me see. Okay, so I wanted to just make sure that people were aware that we have an activist toolkit on our website. And I'll just make sure that it's popped into the chat as well. Let me see. Oh, Ed, are you happy to help with that? Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you. So this is the activist toolkit for the Human Rights Act on our website. And in here, it gives you a little bit of context and background in the Human Rights Act campaign and what Nikita and Satara were talking about. So this campaign has been for a couple of years now, and so we are at a stage that is quite critical. And so I think in the next 12 months, it will be pretty good if our supporters and activists can put some time into thinking about how you want to kind of escalate this, so we can build our movement and bring more people from the community into the campaign. So I'm just scrolling down. So initially, what happened was we thought about kind of breaking it down into 3 phases and how we were going to campaign on this. So the first phase started off with engaging with our community to raise awareness. The second was we said that we were going to utilize our movement to engage with federal politicians and show them that the majority of Australians want a Human Rights Act. And the third phase, which is where we are right now, is we want to work with the community to ensure that a National Human Rights Act contains protections from all human rights abuses. So we've passed that stage where we've got a good recommendation by the committee, which is great. So the things that we want to do next in the next 12 months are not very different from what we've been doing previously. So the things that Satara shared are like concrete examples of things that we need to do, such as meeting MPs, and also bringing in more communities with lived experience to share their stories, because these stories are really critical to show to the government that there is a wide range of people in Australia that really feel that a Human Rights Act would really benefit them and would help them to try and access some rights that are probably not very visible and available to a lot of people. So the tangible things that you could do, a lot of people might know this already, but you can organize a community listening event. And there's resources here that could help you try and form a community listening event. And a town hall and a community listening event are not very different, but a community listening event would be a bit more focused and thematic around what community you want to engage with. We also have some resources here around MP engagement. So here it talks a little bit about the difference between a face-to-face meeting, writing to your MP, calling your MP. You can also use social media to engage with your MP. And you could also invite MPs to like a group event or a community event in your area. So these are some of the types of MP engagement that you could carry, but I think like one of the most powerful ones, and if you've attended an MP engagement meeting before, is that meeting an MP is always really good, and you can kind of like get your message across clearer, and they would take it on board in a probably more serious way, because you're sitting in front of them and then you're actually telling your story. So that's really powerful. And hopefully that will shift them to to make sure that a Human Rights Act is legislated in Parliament by 2025. There is a guide to MP engagement, so there's some resources in here that you can access. But yeah, so what we need to do is just keep organizing, keep mobilizing, and build from phases 1 and 2, and also just working with your communities. And a lot of education sometimes need to happen for maybe people that haven't heard of a Human Rights Act, but probably would agree that it would benefit them as well. So continuous community engagement and having like a very strategic plan on meeting your MPs would be really, really good. So yeah, so that's just a little bit about the toolkit that we have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but going forward, our organizing team is going to propose a couple of dates for future MP engagement training, where we'll do a deeper dive on how you can engage with your MP in a more strategic manner. We had one back in March which had a lot of good feedback. So we will attempt to offer another training for that in the coming months. So yeah, watch that space. But yeah, I'll stop talking here.
Great. Thanks so much, Ara. And now we have a little bit of time for questions. That could be for Nikita on what the Act looked like, for Ira on the toolkit and MP engagement, for myself on some of those actions that we've set up. Put this in the chat, but to ask a question, there's a Q&A function, or everybody should be able to use the chat, or there's also the option to raise your hand, and we can allow attendees to speak. Maybe what I'll do, Nikita, is kick us off with one question that I have before we have any from any attendees. Interested to know if you could share what specific protections might be in the Act or featured in the report for LGBTQIA communities, particularly in the context of religious discrimination bill and other things that have been happening around Parliament for rainbow communities. You might have to unmute.
I didn't mute myself, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. So I think, yeah, this is happening in the context of nearly a decade of government attempts to legislate both protections for religious communities from discrimination, and also to remove what we have in our current laws, which allows religious people to discriminate against LGBTQI plus people as well. And I think what this does, so what we've been saying at Amnesty is obviously that the current laws, which are in the Sex Discrimination Act, that allow religious organizations, particularly schools, to discriminate, should be changed. But the government should also introduce a religious discrimination bill that protects religious people from discrimination. And then I think what the Human Rights Act would do in the middle of that would be to ensure there's a holistic consideration of human rights by the government. So they're not just thinking about this as a binary kind of queer communities versus religious communities, but acknowledging that everybody has human rights and they deserve to be protected. That includes the right to live free from discrimination. But it also, and I think this is where the Human Rights Act would make a difference for queer communities, particularly if, you know, we see the Sex Discrimination Act amended, the religious discrimination bill introduced, and then hopefully that debate forgotten, that you would also see other rights. So we've been so focused in the country on discrimination that we've, I think, forgotten a bit about things like the right to health and housing, and particularly thinking about health, that having the right to health protected in our laws when it comes to, you know, gender affirming surgery and so on, that would need to be looked at through a human rights perspective. And that's something that's really sorely missing when it comes to, you know, Medicare, how those surgeries and so on are funded, and that sort of thing would have to have a human rights lens put on it. And so I think that it's part and parcel of removing the changing the Sex Discrimination Act is a really important step, but then also ensuring that people's rights are positively protected and that they can take action to have those rights protected.
Thanks so much, Nikita. Are there any other questions? I can unmute any attendees if they want to raise their hand to ask something as well.
I have a question, if that's okay. Yes, it's kind of to, I guess, anyone. But I was curious, I haven't actually read through the dissent yet from the coalition, but I was wondering if maybe, Nikita, you what were the kind of things that stood out to you in that, and what was there anything particularly shocking? I mean, other than the fact that they dissented in the first place, but any particular kind of things that you thought was quite interesting to note?
The opposite of shocking, because it's kind of what we've been hearing, you know, for a decade. I think one thing I did note was they kind of said, you know, Australia doesn't have a record of human rights abuses, but they did say that people's not just freedom from discrimination on the basis of their religious beliefs, but also freedom to practice religious beliefs needs to be protected. And I think it shows what a narrow focus there is at the moment from the opposition on this, that they, you know, could think about religious communities who do need to be protected from discrimination and have their rights protected, but they couldn't apply that to other communities, which isn't surprising. You know, it's been a decade of talking about this. And I think all this debate is a good example of why we need a Human Rights Act, so we can think about human rights holistically and applying to everyone as opposed to kind of competing. But yeah, I think it wasn't really shocking that they took that angle, but disappointing. And then the other, I think the surprising thing was a lot of the things in the report were discussed during the inquiry and submissions and in hearings, and they haven't really taken a lot of that on. So yeah, that was again a bit of a disappointment too, because you know what they talked about in terms of religious freedoms is actually addressed in the report, but they've just kind of ignored that. So that was pretty disappointing.
Thanks, Nikita. And we've got another question that's in the Q&A. I can read it out. It's, what's the biggest risk of a Human Rights Act not being passed?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it comes to both the big and the small things. So, you know, right now there's no obligation on a government to consider people's human rights when they make decisions, whether that's passing laws, but also decisions like around aged care funding, around the delivery of aged care services, as an example. And so they consistently make decisions that infringe on people's human rights. And I think we'll continue to do so. And we've seen, you know, in recent weeks, a lot of the talk on debate on refugees. We've gone straight to the focus of human rights, limiting human rights. And it's just, I think, something that we need to create a culture of the government considering human rights when making decisions, but also when it comes to, you know, not just considering them, that there being consequences for their actions when they don't consider human rights and when human rights are abused, and that people will have with the Human Rights Act a tool to take action, whatever that looks like, whether it's making a complaint and you know, resolving the problem with their Centrelink officer, or whether it's, you know, taking something to court. People will have that opportunity. So yeah, I think it's in terms of both the big and the small. There's a lot of risks, but it really is an opportunity to overcome a lot of the problems we see in Australia, and to make the government think about human rights, and also to create a better future where we can kind of take action when rights are abused and so on.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, what Nikita mentioned in terms of opportunity, it is such a great opportunity that we've got a positive report, to kind of like use that as a tool when we're out engaging with MPs or talking to communities and bringing communities to the MPs, because then you can just like refer to the report and just say, hey, this has been recommended. You know, our community is facing some of these human rights abuses, and we don't like that happening within our community, and we want the federal government to actually legislate a Human Rights Act. So it is a very, very big opportunity for us to be doing that in the next 12 months, and it's exciting. So yeah, there are risks, definitely, but there's also like very, very big opportunities here, which is great.
Amazing. Thanks, Ara. I guess that probably brings us to a pretty natural close, talking of all the opportunities that we do have and a few of those actions that we've shared earlier on for how you can stay involved. But thank you everybody for coming along and for listening to a little bit of the discussion and for asking so many great questions. To recap a few of the takeaways that we shared earlier, we have a few things that we're doing at the moment. We've got the Share Your Stories action that's in the chat, and also in the toolkit, we've got the Email Your MPs, asking them to legislate a Human Rights Act and showing that constituency support, and we've got the town halls, and you can email Ira or I if you're interested in organising one of those near you. And then the toolkit has a whole bunch of other useful information around meeting with an MP and some resources if you're wanting to upskill as well. They're all in the chat, and we'll probably wrap up there. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.